Hey everybody, welcome to the Multiply Podcast. This week we're talking about the gospel and self-leadership. Check it out. Hey everybody, welcome to the Multiply Podcast. Welcome back. My name is Jared.
My name is David.
Dave, how you been, man?
Oh man, doing great. How about yourself?
Yeah, you don't look so good.
Well,
that's just a byproduct of old age, I guess.
I am turning 40 this year.
Oh,
Big 4-0.
How you feel about that? Tell the listeners.
I feel great. I feel like, just a number.
Yeah.
Doesn't scare me.
That's a good way to convince yourself.
Halfway through life, probably.
Wow, you're setting your bar a little low there. With advances in technology and science, I would think you're maybe only a third of the way through life.
That's probably pretty high for me, actually, based on my dietary habits.
Well, we all certainly hope that is not true. We wanted to get started in this podcast as we're talking about the gospel and self-leadership. And I think, David, you're one of the best people to speak to this topic. So I'd love to get your thoughts. What comes to your mind? What do you think about when the topic of the gospel and leading ourselves?
Yeah, I think to kind of take a step back when we talk about leadership, I know one of the definitions that people use a lot for leadership is influence. And there's hundreds and thousands of other definitions of leadership, but sometimes people will say, I don't know who I'm leading, I don't have anyone to lead, but we're all ultimately leading ourselves. And so self-leadership is a topic that applies to everybody, no matter what position they find themselves in, what stage of life they find themselves in. And self-leadership is basically the ability to understand yourself, know yourself, lead yourself through good times, bad times, understand your emotions. And so when we talk about the most important practice in self-leadership, we're talking specifically in the context of Christian leadership. And for us, or for me, I should say, the thing that I've learned is the most important practice in my life is the ability to consistently speak the gospel to my own heart, to develop a level of gospel fluency in my life where whatever the situation is happening around me, whatever the challenges are, whatever my team needs, wherever we're headed, there is this consistent ability to be able to remind my heart of the gospel truth.
Okay, so why is that, do you feel like, the most important self-leadership tool? Why is it ranked so high for you?
James K. Smith, in his book, You Are What You Love, he says that to be human means to be animated by and oriented toward some vision of the good life. I'll say it again because it's kind of a fancy sentence from a philosopher, but to be human is to be animated by, which I think means to sort of be put in motion, to be compelled, and to be oriented towards, which speaks of our direction. What are we aiming for? Some vision of the good life. And that phrase, vision of the good life, has really stuck with me since I read his book a couple of years ago. And the idea is that every single person has a personal vision of the good life. What is it going to look like when they arrive? What's it going to look like when they get there? And our proximity to that vision, or our distance from it, our path towards it, or the obstacles between us and it often determine the way that we feel, our emotions, our responses in any given situation. So I say all that to say that for the Christian, the vision of the good life is Jesus, who he is, what he's accomplished for us, the gospel, the good news that God is rescuing all of humanity, renewing all of creation in and through the person work of Jesus Christ on our behalf. That becomes the foundation for my identity, my value, my worth, and my emotions are rooted in this unchanging, unmerited, undeserved work of another on my behalf, and not on my work on my behalf, which is a very sort of not obviously as secure place to rest my sense of self and worth.
Yeah, that's really it's really helpful, and I think it's true when people begin to really think about this, because we all have a whether we realize it or not, for most of us is probably just a subconscious motivator. Mm-hmm. Like, we all have this idea of, man, if I could just get this thing, then I would finally feel satisfied or finally feel happy. And for everybody, it's different. Like, for some, it's when you're young, it's if I could just get this girl to date me or this guy to go out with me. When you get older, if I could just get into this school, if I could just make my parents happy. For some people, I mean, they're 65 years old and they're still thinking that, right? If I could just get my dad to be proud of me or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
And then it's, if I can just make enough money, then I could get this, or then I could that. If I could just have the right promotion at job, if I just had a better marriage, or if I just had a different spouse, or if my kids are just better behaved, or whatever it is, right? We all have those things that motivate us. And I think this is understanding gospel fluency and the need for it in our life is so essential, not just for the roles that we serve in leadership, but as you're saying, how do we lead our own personal lives? Because it reveals the heart and motivation of everything that we do.
Yeah. And I think it's, to take it another step, I think it's, so whatever our vision of the good life is, whatever that thing is that we live for and that we are chasing after, pursuing, it drives us. It's our motivation. It guides us. It directs our choices. But it actually, on a spiritual level, becomes a functional savior to us. So we're looking to that thing to do for us what Jesus alone can do for us and what Jesus has already done for us and is continuing to do that work in us and will complete that work someday, right? So the real issue here is that apart from the regular practice of preaching the gospel to ourselves, we're always going to default to this sort of position of idolatry in our hearts. And I think it's Martin Luther, depending on the translation that you read of his writings, who says something along the lines of that the human heart is a factory of idols, that we're just sort of constantly producing idols, and that anything, everything, can be an idol in our lives and take up that sort of priority. I read a book a few years ago too by it's called The Road to Character by David Brooks, who's a columnist for the New York Times, and he talked about in his introduction, he talked about the difference between resume virtues and eulogy virtues. And this really hit home for me last year when my dad passed away, my brother passed away, and I got to hear their eulogies, and they were both really good at the different things that they did. My dad was a pastor, my brother was a teacher. But at the end of your life, people don't talk as much about your resume virtues, like where you went to school and your education and even your abilities and your excellence in your work. They talk about your eulogy virtues, which was like your kindness and how generous you were and how much time you spent with people, and your legacy. Your legacy is more about your who you were than even what you've done in many cases. And so, but David Brooks talks about, he says there's a phrase in the introduction where he says there's a propensity in our nature. He says there's a perversity in our nature that leads us to get those priorities out of whack. So even though we know it's more important to be with our children, we become slaves to being productive and having success and wealth, and so we give up time with them to be at the office longer. Or even though we know it's a better value or more important value to care for our friends than it is to be interesting at a dinner party, we tell gossip about our friends because in that moment we want to be interesting. Yeah. And he doesn't call it idolatry, and I don't know where he is at with his faith exactly, but that's 100% what he is talking about. And as leaders, let me ask you this. You've been in leadership for a while. What do you think are some of the most prevalent idols in the hearts of leadership, specifically in a ministry setting? What are the things that we tend to crave and chase after, and it looks good because it's in a religious environment, but in the end it can be actually destroying our lives?
Yeah, I think number one is approval. And actually, I think that applies beyond just ministry leaders, but I think that applies to actually all of humanity. Like there's very few. Usually, people that don't care about approval are like borderline sociopaths in some way. Like those are the psycho serial killers, right? Like I think for all of us, and part of this is too based on how we were created. Like God made us to be in relationship with people, but we kind of distort the beauty of creation and use it in a way it wasn't intended. And so, I know for me, like if you're a pastor and you preach or you do sermons, right? It's like how much of, even while you're up there in the midst, right? Like the reaction of the audience, or how well you think people think of you. Do they think I'm funny? Do they think I'm smart? Do they think whatever the thing is that I tend to feel like whatever the thing is that gets you approval as a person or a communicator, that's the thing you'll look for. Mm-hmm. And then your whole emotions will be based on whether or not you think you're getting that. So you step down off of preaching, and it's like, if you think people thought you were funny and smart, at least those are some of mine. It's like, oh man, that was powerful. Like that was a great sermon. I feel so good. And then if you're like, there's no reaction and no one says, hey, great word, man, or no one comes up, it's like, why am I even doing this? I might as well do something else,
Mm-hmm. So if your approval idol is attached to people thinking you're funny and you're smart, you must be miserable all the time.
Well, I don't know. Believe it or not, I mean, it gets fed a lot,
That's why you had 2 children.
Yeah, that's true.
They always think you're
they laugh
funny
at
and smart.
anything. It's great.
I think that the really dark side of this is that whatever becomes our functional savior then has control over us. We're enslaved to it. It's our master. And Tim Keller is so helpful in this conversation. Has been so formative in my own understanding of the need for gospel fluency. And so one of the guys that I know was very influential for him was Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. And he said that a lot of our unhappiness in our own lives is directly related to the fact that we're listening to ourselves instead of talking to ourselves. And there's always this internal dialogue going on, within ourselves. And our ability to talk to ourselves is so much faster than our ability to even hear or process things that are happening outside of us. And so in any given moment, like you were giving the example, you're up front preaching, and even as you're preaching and even as you're talking, you're still able to, in your head, be thinking, do they like me? Do they like this? Why is that person sleeping? Why don't they take that baby out? All that stuff is
Why
going
is that
on.
guy giving me the middle finger?
Right.
Oh, wait, that's actually my brother? What?
Yeah, I don't know that example, but
Oh, no?
Yeah, that's just you.
Just me. Okay.
So you have this constant. So the idea of gospel fluency is, how do I speak the gospel to myself in any given moment to remind myself of what is true? And I think Spurgeon called it the most important task that a Christian has is every day to preach the gospel to themselves. And so, what are some practical ways that you've tried to work that in to your own life in ministry and leadership?
Yeah, this has been a game changer for me, because one of the things that it revealed to me is it showed me that all sin is motivated by idolatry, right? So my good behavior and my bad behavior is ultimately motivated by the sin of worshiping and looking to something that's not Jesus. That's what makes it sin. And so for me, this was eye-opening. And I'll give a personal example, and then I'll tell you the practical tool that I use that actually developed kind of out of this example. There's one time my wife came home, and she was out doing something. She was coming back to the house, and I was like, you know what? I'm gonna clean the whole house. Like I'm gonna do something great for her. So I cleaned the whole house. And typical, you know how men are, like, if you have this ability to clean an entire house in like 13 minutes, you know what I mean? Like it's not an A quality work. Nah. It's like a C+, but it could look like an A quality.
Just pushing things out of the line of sight.
Exactly. So I'm running around, I'm cleaning, I'm doing dishes. I'm like, oh, it's going to be awesome. And my wife comes home, and I'm expecting her to walk in and be like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. Like, it looks beautiful. And she walks in and doesn't say a word about it. And all of a sudden, like, I don't know if you've ever been angry at somebody and you have no idea why you're angry at them. You ever have that happen? Like, your emotions are kind of riled up. You're like, why am I so, like, frustrated or irritated at this person?
Towards you a lot.
Yeah, I can sense that. So that happened, and I remember we got in a little fight, and my wife, she had to leave to go to another appointment, so she leaves the house, and I'm like, what was that about? Why was I so mad at her? And I started to realize, and this is where I came up with this process, I started to realize the reason I was mad at her was because she didn't come in and acknowledge what I'd done for her. And all of a sudden, it was like the realization, you didn't do that for her, you did it for yourself. Like, you were desiring her approval. You wanted her to come home and go, you're an amazing husband. You wanted her to go on Facebook and be like, my husband's so amazing, and everybody else would like it. And, And so I realized in that moment, okay.
You are so depraved. I can't even. I think our audience can't even relate to what
is this what's going to happen on the podcast? I share moments of honesty, and then I just get thrown under the bus?
I'll share a terrible one in a second.
Okay, good. And so I realized in that moment, I'm like, you know what? I've got to figure out a way of assessing my idols and speaking the gospel to myself. So for me, I did a process called look in, look up, look out. And it's really simple. Like, when I read my emotions, because your emotions, as you said earlier, are kind of an indicator of your heart idols being manifested. And so I would read my emotions, those moments when I'm really mad. I'd ask myself, what am I looking to outside of Christ right now to find my value and worth, or to find my identity? And oftentimes I would realize it's approval. So in that moment, I'd say, okay, here's what I'm really looking for. Here's where I'm really mad. And the second part, look up, is preach the gospel to yourself. So look up to Christ. Like, remind yourself of who he is, that he's your identity. You don't need to look to approval to find it. And the third step, look out, is if you wrong somebody like I did in that moment, now you're diffused. Your emotions are not there. You realize you have what you need, and so you can go and apologize and make it right. And so for me, that was a really helpful tool that I've used and still do to help me assess and preach the gospel to myself.
That's great. I do appreciate you sharing that. I think that, as far as identifying what our heart idols are, some of the questions I've asked are things like, where do I turn for comfort on a bad day? What gives me the greatest joy? Sort of what brings this sort of inordinate amount of emotion to my life, whether it's good or bad? Yeah. What's the root of that? What do I want people to most quickly learn about me when they first meet me?
Oh, that's good.
That tends to be something that matters maybe too much to me.
Hey, did you guys ever know I wrote 2 books? He said that so many times, I can't even tell you guys.
Well, more than 2, right?
Oh, that was a test. That was a test.
I know we got to finish up here, but I have 3 little girls, and recently I was driving my 10-year-old, my 7-year-old to school, and I was about to say I was sitting in the front seat, but I guess that's kind of redundant because they're 10 and 7.
My 7-year-old was driving, teaching her young.
Since we're confessing things. I was driving, and my 10-year-old from the back, we had the music going a little bit, and my 10-year-old from the back says, "Dad, do you have a piece of paper for my homework?" And I thought, what? I was like, what did you say? And so I turned the music down a little bit. She said it again, and I thought I heard it exactly the same. "Dad, do you have a piece of paper for my homework?" And now I'm irritated because I'm thinking, she told us she'd finished her homework last night, and now she's trying to do her homework in the car. So I'm like, I kind of snap at her a little bit, and she goes, "No, I didn't say homework. I said bookmark. I want a piece of paper for my bookmark." And then I was like, oh, okay, yeah. So I ripped off a little piece of paper and handed it back to her. And then she laughed at me and was like, why did you think I said homework? And she's laughing at me. Now, any sort of like sane person would just kind of play it off and be like, well, the music's playing. Dude, I went into this lecture where I basically was like, Lilia, I want you to think about the word bookmark, and I want you to think about the word homework, and I want you to tell me everything they have in common.
Oh my God.
And she's
sounds like child abuse.
And she's like, school? I'm like, no. The actual words, like the way they're structured, the way that they sound. And she like totally couldn't get it. So I had to like then teach her. I'm like, okay, well, they both have 2 syllables. They both end with a K, so they have the K sound at the end. They both have an O in the front, even though it's pronounced differently, bookmark, homework. But it's basically, I'm trying to defend myself. Like, how can you laugh at me that I misunderstood you when these 2 words actually are kind of similar?
Right.
And I mean, I got so irritated with her. And when it was done, I felt like 2 inches tall because I realized, like, in that moment, it was this ugly idol of being a good communicator, an ugly idol of respect, this terrible idol of even being able to control situations and control my daughter. And I realized, man, I have so much growth in my life to do when it comes to believing the gospel. So speaking the gospel to my heart in that moment, like, if one of my idols is the need to be right, I have to constantly remind myself that because of Jesus' work, I'm righteous before the Father. And it's not a righteousness of my own. It's a righteousness, according to Romans, it's a righteousness apart from the law. There's really nothing I can do to make myself righteous. Right. And if I'm right before the eyes of the only judge in the universe that actually matters, then why do I so desperately need to be right in front of the eyes of my 10-year-old daughter? Right. It's because I'm forgetting the gospel. So, the most helpful book I've ever read on this, by the way, is Tim Chester's book, You Can Change. And he talks about the 4 G's, that God is great, glorious, good, and gracious. And I'll finish with this. Because God is great, he says we don't have to be in control. Puts to death our control idols. Because God is glorious, we don't have to fear others. When we see God for who he is, we respect, awe him and fear him and not others. Because God is good, we don't have to look everywhere else for pleasure. He satisfies us. And because God is gracious, we don't have to prove ourselves. And I've actually walked into interviews, actually the interview for the job that you're now sitting in, where as I was walking in the room, I was rehearsing those truths to myself. I was saying, God is great, God is glorious, God is good, God is gracious. And it seems like, routine or almost not spiritual to be just, it's like a mantra. But actually, I think we have to do things like that to preach the gospel to ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're a leader out there listening, I hope you see the importance of this, not just for our personal lives, because it does affects how we parent, how we operate in our marriages, how we're sons and daughters and brothers and sisters and neighbors and all that stuff. But as a leader too, understanding this in your personal leadership will help you assess every motivation for even the good things, because there's a really high potential that you could have a lot of success, air quotes, right?
Yeah.
But the motives of why you're doing everything that you do is because you're worshiping something other than Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, we're going to transition into our portion of the podcast called David's Eats. David, everybody wants to know, what's the best thing you've eaten all week?
Well, there's something that's kind of unique to upstate New York, specifically really Syracuse, Utica area, and it's something called chicken riggies. And chicken riggies is a pasta dish, and the riggies is short for rigatoni, so it's a rigatoni pasta. And then there's usually chicken breasts diced and cooked in with it, and peppers and onions, and then there's can be different levels of spice. I like it spicy because I'm half Korean.
Amen.
And then they do like the sauce is a little hard to explain. It's got a little cream in it. It's kind of, you've had it before. How would you describe it?
I don't know. It's like you want to lean towards like a pasta vodka sauce, but it's not really like that. Right. It's kind of different.
Yeah, it's like a creamy red sauce, creamy sauce. But anyway,
maybe heaven in a sauce.
Heaven sauce.
Yeah.
So there's a place right here near us called Francesca's that just makes this delicious chicken riggies. And actually, most Sundays after church, after I preach, I get in the car with my girls and we drive over, and my wife and I split a salad. Just health conscious.
Right.
And a bowl of chicken riggies. And then my oldest girl loves chicken wings, so she orders 12. The good news is she only likes the flats, so I end up eating at least 6 wings in addition to my riggies and my salad and my Diet Coke.
Right. You got to be healthy. You got to watch your body.
So, yeah, chicken riggies. If you're not in upstate New York, I don't know if you can find them, but you might be able to find a recipe online for them and try and make them.
There you go. All right. Hey, thanks everybody for listening. This is the Multiply Podcast. We'll see you guys next time.